Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Ryan Deemer, Enterprise Systems Engineer at Veeam Software. The topic of today's episode is called PreSales Career Paths, Going Upmarket. You might remember one of our early podcast episodes with Don Carmichael about PreSales Career Paths. Well, we're going to continue the conversation here. In today's episode, we're going to talk about Ryan's journey from inside sales engineer to field sales engineer. Sometimes organizations call this going upmarket from SMB, mid-market to enterprise, or insert whatever segment name that you have. Ryan and I are going to talk about his journey, why he made the move, some of the benefits, some of the pros, some of the cons, and some of the why around someone would want to move upmarket. But I'm here to tell you that there's too much pressure put on individuals to move upmarket. There are some people that are built for inside sales. There are some people that are built for field sales because they can be very different sales cycles and result in very different types of sales engineers. So Ryan and I are going to talk about that in today's episode. Enjoy. Hey, Ryan, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How's it going today?
Doing good, James. How are you?
I am great. I am glad that we are talking about today's topic because it is something that I have a lot of opinions on, and I know that you do as well. But before we get there, Ryan, I want to ask how 2021 is going for you.
2021 is going good. It's a new year, so we have a new number, we have new sales rules, and it's already starting off to be in a very busy and challenging 2021.
And you had your sales kickoff recently, and it was virtual, right?
We did, yeah. So due to where we're at global pandemic-wise, we had to move to a virtual sales kickoff, which was a bit different. Last year, we were all in person. We get to meet each other. And so it was a transition, but it was still good. It was still a few good days of learning the new products and things that are going to be up and coming for this year.
I do think that sitting and learning in front of your computer for sometimes upwards of 8 hours, day over day, can be challenging. So I tend to ask people how their sales kickoffs have gone because some have kind of adapted to the virtual world and done things a little bit differently. And some are operating as it was in person. So it's interesting to hear that. You actually had a really good 2020. Is that correct?
We did. So I have to commend the pod that we call it for their hard work and dedication in 2020. And we were fortunate enough to meet and exceed our quota. So very proud of the team for all their hard work.
Ryan, let's talk about you a little bit. Tell us how you got into pre-sales.
I was looking for my next challenge and I kept driving by the Veeam office. I had used Veeam previously and really liked the platform, how it worked, how it performed, and made my job easier. And while looking for that position, I saw that they had an inside systems engineer open. And so I read through the job description a few times and I thought, this could be fun. I think I could do this. And so I applied and then someone called me and learned more about the position, and it changed my entire career trajectory. I never really thought of myself as a salesperson, but after, getting into the sales engineer role, I realized it's a mix of technology, dealing with people, and some sales, and it's a wild, fun ride.
I love that you drove past and were like, hey, that company is really interesting to me. The days of companies having offices. That's a really cool story, Ryan. Well, let's talk about today's topic, pre-sales career paths, going up market. I know that you and I have talked about this on a number of occasions via Slack, talked about our opinions on this. And I could tell you that many people in the pre-sales collective have asked me about these topics. And so let's, for the audience, probably define what upmarket means. Many times organizations may have a small, medium business segment, a mid-market segment, enterprise segment, maybe multiple segments. And a lot of times those segments have different selling motions. So for instance, SMB may or may not be very transactional, but typically tends to be virtual. And enterprise tends to be a little bit longer sales cycles that are usually in person. And sometimes companies call these inside sales engineers or field sales engineers. And so that's the premise of today's episode when we talk about upmarket. Do you have anything to add there, Ryan?
I would say that the inside sales engineers, they'll tend to focus on mastering the demo, doing the remote webinars, enabling the inside sales team, and then removing roadblocks for those customers. So any technical questions or limitations, they're going to jump on calls, remove all those roadblocks, handle the smaller proof of concept and trials. And there still might be, some light travel. Now, the field SEs, we're going to be focusing on in-person meetings, taking people to lunches and dinners, speaking at the industry events that they might be required to attend. They also focus a lot on whiteboarding and in-person presentations, whereas the insides, they're going to focus on the demo. Field is going to be more high-level whiteboarding, architect out their environment for them. Another big component is answering RFPs and RFIs that the larger companies put out. A lot of times, larger companies put out requests for proposals or information, and your company or product service might need to respond to that. And that will be a lot of times fall on the sales team as well as the SE involved.
Thanks for providing that perspective, Ryan. It is so interesting, like how the sales cycles can be different based on market segment. Sometimes these companies segment these customers by revenue size or employee count, but it is very interesting about how different they operate and how the skill set for an inside sales engineer versus a field sales engineer can be very different. So let's talk about those differences. You mentioned a couple of items, but what would you say are the biggest differences?
Well, I would say the biggest differentiator would be travel. Travel to me is you're going to be doing it often, and maybe not in today's world, but normally you're going to be on a plane traveling to different customers, which is going to put some strain on things depending on the schedule and the size of your territory. The positions are also different because the engagements are going to be much larger and bigger, more complex. And your proof of concept might be 30 days, but it could be, possibly a couple months, depending on the product or service being sold. You also have the go-to-market is going to be a different positioning than, your SMB. The larger customers, they're going to be targeted differently. And so the sales motion is going to be a little bit different. It's not going to be as transactional. It's going to take a lot longer time to close these bigger deals.
That's so good that you talked about like the bigger deals component, because I have talked about this on a couple of episodes, including with Don Carmichael in an early PreSales Career Paths episode, where I do feel like that there is a lot of pressure on people to move up market. And let's use a SMB mid-market enterprise example for right now, because the selling motions can be very different. But I also do feel like there is a misconception that SMB can't have big deals. So for the company that I'm at right now, we've actually seen some of our biggest deals come from SMB. And I think that the narrative is changing a bit. Do you have any perspective on that?
I would agree. Just because it's a smaller company on employee size or revenue size doesn't mean that they're not growing very rapidly. And especially in the startup world, you could see some very good deals. And we have a lot of our SMB sales engineers and reps, they do very well from themselves because it's just a different type of transaction model, a different selling motion. And the nice thing about SMB is it can be a lot quicker. Whereas the enterprise, the deal might be much larger, but it might take you a year or a year and a half to close it. So you could close 10 to 20 SMBs and it could equal or even be greater than that one enterprise deal.
Very good point. And I think what's a good distinction too is if you work for a company that's single product versus multi-product or platform. For example, the companies that have SMB, but they have 20 products to sell, their deals might be bigger and might be different. One of the things that I do feel is a misconception, and I just kind of shadowed this a little bit, is that career progression means moving up market. I do think that there are some people that are built for inside sales or built for SMB, and there are some people that are built for enterprise. Your comment about you could close dozens of SMB or mid-market deals versus one enterprise deal, that's a big difference. And some people love the idea of working with one customer, two customer, and having this big complex engagement, but you kind of live and die by that engagement. And if that doesn't close in your fiscal year, that does and can alter your compensation. And, I've had people come to me and say, hey, I really want to work for your team. I really want to work in your org, but I have to tell them that the difference is between managing 5 accounts managing 30 accounts and managing 150 accounts is very, very different. And I do think that some people are built for that more transactional, quick operating model. And some individuals are better suited for the more complex and in-depth nature of true enterprise sales. Let me get your perspective on this, Ryan. Why do you think people want to transition from SMB to enterprise or inside sales to field sales?
I think based on what your comment earlier, they just think it's the natural progression. And there's so many different opportunities that are in front of you. And you might like the quick SMB type sales model where you can move quickly, you can knock out 20 customers a week. Whereas when you're in the enterprise, it's a lot slower. It's harder to get in front of those customers. And when you do, you need to make sure that you have your game together. And so there's a lot more stress as well in relation to that.
You mentioned complexity because the decisions made revolve around multiple decision makers, multiple organizations, potentially complicated product and IT infrastructure. Ryan, why did you want to move from inside sales to field?
So I made the jump to field SE because I wanted to be in front of the customers more and get the ability to travel and have a bigger impact on the sales team where I can help close the deals faster.
I appreciate that perspective, Ryan. That is really interesting. And I think that's probably a good reason why anyone would want to move up market. Let's talk about some of the challenges that happen with moving up market. For you, what was the biggest challenge that you faced after getting promoted to a field role?
So one of the biggest challenges I faced was when I was in a face-to-face meeting with a customer and they ask you a direct question that you don't know the answer to. And when you have a product line with several products and services, you can't remember everything. And when you're on the inside, you tend to have the ability to Google or check internal documentation. But when you're in front of a customer, you don't have that luxury. So you have to say you don't know the answer. And I think that's completely okay. But the only thing is that you just have to remember to always follow up with that customer and let them know the answer to that question. And I think that's just one way to build that rapport within the account.
And I'm glad you brought up rapport in the account. So are you familiar with the concept of Stump the Chump?
Yes, very familiar.
So for those listening who don't know what Stump the Chump is, we actually had an episode on this. Recently, I got a request to do a part 2. But the idea of walking into a room and somebody is trying to prove that they are way smarter than you and ask you sometimes ridiculous questions to essentially make you look bad or to get their point across. Sometimes this happens in organizations because there's a political nature of your product or software coming in and replacing. And so I feel like in the enterprise or field sales, you have organizations that have built their infrastructure, right? They've built their products and they don't necessarily want to bring in the outside vendors. And so you get a little bit more of the Stump the Chump component because there's a much broader political impact in these bigger organizations. And so would you say that you face that a little bit more often than what you did in an inside role? And if so, how do you face those situations if one of your biggest challenges was not being able to answer things in front of customers?
Yes, absolutely. Stump the Chump is a game that I don't think any SEs like to play because there's really no right answer. You need to give an answer that is true and accurate, but you also don't want to overstep to make that person feel inferior. So it's a very tight line to walk. You just have to make sure that you come across as helping. A lot of times the product or service is not meant to replace a person or a position. It's to save time or money for the business. And it's about retraining that individual to say, hey, this is going to make your life easier. It's going to make your life better. This is not trying to replace you.
Very well said, Ryan. And for anyone who wants to hear more about Stump the Chump, PreSales Podcast, episode 16 with Steve Klein. So Ryan, let's continue to talk about this theme of why field sales or why upmarket to the enterprise. What would you say are some of the downsides to working in a field sales role?
There are some downsides. Depending on your situation, there could be substantial time away from family, and that could put a burden on childcare or elderly care. So that's something that you really have to think about. There's also the odd working hours due to travel. If you have to get up at 6 a.m. to catch a flight for a lunch meeting, and then you're there all day for a few more meetings and then fly back, well, you did 3 meetings that day, but have you got your other work done? And so your other work might have to go into the evening or on the plane. And so that's just one of the things that you're going to have to think about. Another thing is the sales process could be a challenge. Earlier you mentioned, James, that some people are meant for SMB, some people are meant for enterprise. And moving up market could challenge that and could make that sales transition a bit harder.
Ryan, I love that you brought up other work done, because I think that is one of the most underrated items about working in enterprise sales or field sales, is that the rest of your work is still waiting for you. And you have to get really good at working on airplanes, working in taxis and Ubers and Lyfts and whatever it might be, because that work is still waiting for you. Work travel is not always so glamorous. Some people really believe like, oh, I want to go do field sales because I get to travel and go to all these customer visits. It's sometimes really tough when you literally have to wake up, go to the airport, get in on an airplane, go to a customer meeting, go back to the airport, fly home. Or you have to leave the night before. And some of those stresses that you mentioned on family really do play a role and a factor. There's been many of times that I have been stuck in airports for 3, 4, 5, 10 hours because I went to a customer meeting that was 2 hours long, but weather, travel delays. And that's a very underrated part of the job. So I'm glad you brought that up. Could you explain a little bit more about why someone might not be a good fit for field sales? I think you've covered this a couple of times, but I want to ask this very specifically.
I think you need to kind of look within to make sure it's really the next best step for you personally. It might be a good fit for you to move to the field, but it might not. So the travel might be extensive. So do you have the ability to just pick up and get on a plane? Do you have elderly and childcare that you need to split with your husband or wife? Trying to break away from that could be hard. It really just depends on you personally if it's a good fit or not.
I'm going to put you on the spot with a prediction right here. So COVID and this global pandemic has really changed the way sales operates. I mean, so many individuals like yourself who are traveling in the field, you've essentially had to transition, whether you wanted to or not, to almost a field sales and virtual environment. So do you think that that is here to stay, that everyone in field sales is an inside sales engineer? Or are we going to see a transition back to the way things were?
So I think there will be a transition back to the way things were more traditionally. Now, will it go all the way back to 100%? I don't know. I think it's going to be close just because I think competition is going to drive that behavior. Because if you're in a business where you need to take your customers out to lunch and dinner to help win over these deals, you're going to have to do that. Because if you're not, your competition will.
Very good point on the competition. That is a very big aspect of things. So Ryan, what advice do you have for people who maybe feel the pressure to go into field sales or to go up market?
I would say do it for the right reason. Make sure it's what you want. But I think even more important than that is, does the product or the service that you are supporting, does it perform well up market? And the reason I pose that question is because you don't want to be in a situation where you're talking to an enterprise customer. Their demands and their requirements are going to be a lot more than an SMB customer. So will that product scale to their needs? Will it be able to meet their needs? You don't want to be in a tough spot where you go and talk about a solution, but you know that it's not going to perform well. And that could put you in a very tough position.
Ryan, really appreciate your thoughts there as well. Again, this has just been something that's been top of mind for me. I feel like so many times people feel the pressure to move up market, but I like that you talked about the product and the services performing. Many times companies want to go up market because they see that that's where the bigger deals are. And at the end of the day, many companies and products are not actually built to work at every single segment. I have seen that in my career plenty of times. And sometimes that puts a lot of stress on individuals within the organization, the company as well. And so I think that's a really good perspective. And I'm glad we talked about it on the episode. Ryan, really appreciate your time on the PreSales Podcast today. I love that we're starting this conversation around upmarket, and I love hearing your story and really your reasonings and positioning on the differences between inside and field sales. So thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, James.
All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Very happy Ryan joined us, and it was great to hear his journey. Ryan's actually very involved with the PreSales Collective. He runs our local Arizona group. So if you're an Arizona resident and you're not part of that group, please go and join us. We're raising awareness to pre-sales professionals in Arizona. I like that Ryan talked about his journey and some of the reasons why he made the move. One of the things that I asked him to do was talk about the pros and the cons and really why somebody would want to make the move. And I think it's good to hear that he talked about the selling motion being different. He wanted to go from the transactional nature of just doing demos to be in person, whiteboarding, lunch meetings, RFP, RFIs. And that's very much a difference between the SMB, mid-market, and enterprise segment. Ryan talked about one of the drawbacks being travel and all the travel that you have to do. And so I really liked his perspective, and I'm very glad that he brought this up. One of the things that matters to me is what I feel is the pressure that is put on people to move up market. I do understand if your organization believes that that is the progression that a solutions engineer should go through, but they are different selling motions. And some people thrive in the transactional nature or the fast pace of SMB or inside sales versus field sales. And I don't think we should be looking at them as upward trajectory, more so around what makes the most sense for the individual and the business. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If something resonated with you, I'd love it if you reach out and let me know. This is a topic that I have a lot of interest in, and I would love to continue the conversation. As always, like and share the podcast. Otherwise, we will see you next week.